Welcome to Global India Cultural Fusion Podcast. I'm your co-host Shakira Tarachand. Our host, Dr. Lilly Sanathanan, will moderate today's discussion on solutions to the Ukraine crisis by buzzing bees. This indeed is a world crisis. What exactly does it mean for the world? As humans, are we going backwards? The world suffered a striking blow for over a year with COVID, and now this war. Vladimir Lenin once remarked, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. We are living such weeks right now. We are honored to have Professor Ravindranathan join us for a lively discussion. Lilly, over to you now.
Thank you, Shakira. We have as our guest a geopolitical expert who is eminently qualified to address today's topic, solutions to the Ukraine crisis. I'm delighted to introduce Professor C.P. Ravindranathan, who has served as the Indian ambassador to various countries for 35 years, countries like Fiji, Algeria, Ireland, and Philippines. He was also High Commissioner to Australia. He received his master's degree in political science from the Presidency College in Chennai, India. He ranked third in the highly competitive Indian Foreign Service exam conducted at the All India level before entering the prestigious IFS arena. Professor Ravindranathan is currently Vice Chairman of the Xavier Institute of Management and Entrepreneurship in Bangalore, India. Thank you, Ravi, for joining us on this podcast and sharing your insights with us. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has resulted in a humanitarian disaster, the magnitude of which the world had not seen since World War II. As of March 20th, at least 902 civilians have died and 1,459 have been injured. Many Russian attacks have hit highly populated areas, causing civilians to seek refuge in subway stations and leaving hundreds of thousands without electricity, water, or basic supplies. According to the UN Refugee Agency, 10 million people, or about a quarter of the population, have been displaced. And of that, nearly 4 million have fled to neighboring countries. The war, coupled with COVID-19, has brought untold suffering to the Ukrainians. Let us first express our empathy for the Ukrainian people by observing 1 minute of silence. After that, we can try to address the issues underlying this conflict that is threatening world peace, and perhaps we can offer some solutions. Thank you. The concept of Vasudeva Kudumbakam, which means the world is one family, is more pertinent than ever in this Ukrainian situation. What is happening in Ukraine is obviously affecting the entire world in varying degrees. The problem in Ukraine is political on the surface, but deep down, there are religious and social elements at play. Perhaps spiritual leaders like the Pope and the Swamijis can convey this idea of harmonization more effectively to political leaders who are on their ego trips. And perhaps they can bring about some sort of conflict resolution. Winston Churchill defined Russia aptly as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. To understand this riddle, it might be helpful to delve a bit into the history and geography of Ukraine. Ukraine is located in Eastern Europe. It is the second largest country on the European continent after Russia. The capital is Kiev. A fully independent Ukraine emerged only late in the 20th century after long periods of successive domination by Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Ukraine had experienced a brief period of independence from 1918 to 1920, but portions of Western Ukraine were ruled by Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia in the periods between the two world wars. And Ukraine thereafter became part of the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. When the Soviet Union began to unravel from 1990 to 1991, the legislature of the Ukrainian SSR declared sovereignty and then outright independence. And that was confirmed by popular approval in a plebiscite. With the dissolution of USSR in December 1991, Ukraine gained full independence. Ukraine is bordered by Belarus to the north, Russia to the east, the Sea of Azov and Black Sea to the south, Moldova and Romania to the southwest, and Hungary and Slovakia and Poland to the west. I will now turn the discussion over to the panel. Let me start with Professor Ravindranathan. Ravi, I'm sure with your background as a diplomat, you bring a unique political perspective to the table. Can you give us your take on the Ukrainian situation, both from a political and a social perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Lily. You gave a very instructive kind of introduction to the topic of the war in Ukraine. It really sets the issue in perspective. Well, it's of course a large theme, but I will briefly say that what is happening in Ukraine in terms of the Ukraine, in terms of Russia-Ukraine war, should be seen as part of a continuous evolution of the security situation in Europe. As you know, in the 90s of the last century, the Cold War had come to an end with the dismantlement of Soviet Union as the high point, as you mentioned. After that, various parts of the Soviet Union became independent, Ukraine being one. But till then, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union, I think since the end of the 18th century, 1796 or something like that. Now, one or two important facts one should remember is that Russia is the largest state in the world. It is certainly the most powerful European country in terms of military strength. And Russia, as a major power in Europe, has its own security concerns. After the Cold War, which was a kind of rivalry, which was a rivalry between the Anglo-American bloc and this Soviet bloc for in terms of military power and global influence, Russia had settled down to her new dispensation. That is Russia as a nation state. And Russia was concerned not any longer with the ideological struggle with the United States, but primarily with its own economic development, on which it had been lagging behind under communist rule. And secondly, to concern itself with the imperatives of its own national security. In this case, as you know, although the Cold War had ended and Russia had settled down to a different evolution after that, the NATO, the aim of which was to contain what was called Soviet expansionism, continued. What is more, NATO, although there was even a talk at one time that there was no rationale for NATO anymore, it could even be wound down, it did not happen. On the contrary, NATO had been expanding in terms of membership. Some of the erstwhile parts of the Soviet Union, which had now become independent, had been brought in as members. It was Latvia, Lithuania, countries like this, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, all these countries which were part of Eastern Europe European neighborhood of Soviet Union, or parts of what had been Soviet Union had all been brought into the NATO. To the growing concern of Russia. Russia certainly had reacted, quite candidly to the expansion of NATO, expressing her misgivings about what it will involve. And Russia in particular was insistent that Ukraine, which was a neighboring state with which it had been intimately linked historically, the same entity as you recall, Russia was at great pains to emphasize that Ukraine should not become a member of the NATO. That will bring what Russia saw as a military threat posed by NATO right up to her borders. She did not want that to happen. She had made it very clear. But apparently, this had not made much of an effect on either Ukraine or the NATO itself. There was a continued push to bring in NATO into NATO. Ukraine also had wanted to become a member of the NATO, but Russia objected to it. And this was the background to Russia's military action in Ukraine, the aim of which is to, one, to prevent Ukraine from taking the course of getting itself inducted into NATO. Secondly, to ensure that Ukraine will be neutral, assuming the same status as that of Finland and Sweden in the same part of Europe. So this is the provocation for the war. Russia had made no secret of its objection to Ukraine's addition to NATO. So perhaps if there had been a dialogue between Ukraine and Russia on the one hand, and NATO and Russia on the other, and this had resulted in Ukraine going slow on entry to the NATO or declaring eventually her neutral status, perhaps the war would not have happened. So this is what I could say by way of the geopolitical context of the Ukraine war. So even now, if Ukraine were to give a guarantee that it will be neutral between NATO and Russia, and will not seek membership of NATO, there is, I should imagine, there is scope for talks and eventually peace being re-established.
So how does Russia, Ukraine not joining NATO benefit Russia?
NATO is a military alliance. A military alliance against whom? Mm-hmm. It had been conceived originally as a military alliance to contain what was called the Soviet expansionism. But today, Russia is not an expansionist power, according to Russia's own policymakers. Of course, Russia doesn't say it was an expansionist power earlier. This was more part of the Cold War rhetoric. So NATO's purpose was to safeguard the independence. I'm just saying that this was the declared aim of NATO, was to safeguard the security and independence of Europe against what was then Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. But after the dismantlement of Soviet Union, arguably there was no the scope for NATO as a means of containing the former Soviet Union had been reduced, if not disappeared. Mm-hmm. So where was the need for further strengthening NATO in terms of membership, and particularly bringing a country with which Russia was sharing a border to NATO, that is Russia's objection to this development. So if there had been accommodation on this question between Ukraine and Russia, the war would not have happened. That's my point. Even now, if there was to be a dialogue aimed at bringing about a ceasefire, I think Russia would insist that Ukraine should not pursue her proposal to join the NATO, and NATO should draw a line somewhere, keeping Ukraine out of its membership. In the same way as Sweden and Finland are not members. That's my point.
Well, thank you, Ravi, for that really good summary. But do you think that the motivation for Putin was entirely on account of the NATO potential membership, or were there other hidden agendas like, economic domination and obviously social and political domination as well? And if, for example, Putin had succeeded to win this war, in whatever sense you want to interpret it, then I don't think Putin would have stopped at Ukraine. I mean, don't you think Putin would have gone beyond Ukraine to claim his supremacy in a sense?
Well, what Russia's made, what NATO's move to expand its membership, particularly including Ukraine, shows is that although Cold War had officially and for all purposes ended in 1990s, in actual fact, it still continues. There is a kind of rivalry between NATO, led by the United States, and consisting of Western Europe, and what United States and Europe consider to be Russia as a rival. So that Cold War situation and that Cold War thinking apparently still continue. For another, every country has its own concerns about its security. For example, we in India are concerned about security in the Indian Ocean, across our borders with China, and across our borders with Pakistan and Kashmir. In the same way, historically, Russia's concern has been the security of our land frontiers. As the biggest geographical space in the world, embodied in a nation state, Russia has legitimate concerns about the security of our land frontiers. Her land frontiers are exposed to potential threat from other countries in Western Europe or in Europe and across the border with China, notably. So on these frontiers, Russia would like to have her security interests safeguarded, maintained, with a combination of military strength and related foreign policy postures. In Western Europe, Soviet Union is at great pains to point out that there is a certain limit beyond which NATO, whatever may be its argument, should not expand. It should not become a threat to Soviet Russia's land frontiers. Historically, the invasion route to Russia has mostly been through what is now Ukraine.
Yeah.
And she apprehends that if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, a military threat in future to Russia is possible.
No, I think I agree with that point of view, Ravi, but I think more recently, though, Ukraine seems to have agreed to stay neutral and not join NATO. The concession from Ukraine should make it easier for both sides to reach a diplomatic solution. What other terms and conditions would be required to bring about a diplomatic solution?
Yeah, well, there have been declarations about Ukraine's intention not to pursue her membership bid in NATO. But I thought these statements were mostly after the commencement of the war.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, before the commencement of the war, at best, there was a great deal of ambiguity on this question. There is also, I think, a constitutional provision or a political declaration in Ukraine, at any rate, that Ukraine's eventual intention is to become part of NATO. So Ukraine would need to do more than just alluding to or rhetorically declaring that its intention to become member of NATO would not be pursued. It would need to express its readiness to amend the constitution to say that Ukraine will be a neutral state and will not join any alliance against neighboring countries. And that would have included NATO, or specifically that there could have been a written agreement with Russia, or as part of the European security architecture, that Ukraine will not join any military alliance. You have such provisions in the conduct of different states. For example, Switzerland, as I mentioned earlier, also Sweden and Finland. So like that, Ukraine could have moved to a formal declaration of neutrality.
Yeah,
and
but
there was a period of about 2 or 3 weeks when America kept saying that Russia was likely to invade Ukraine. Perhaps that was the time there could have been a very serious dialogue between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine assuring that there could be talks about her membership bid for NATO, and that could be discussed, and eventually some settlement mutually acceptable could have been agreed at.
Yeah.
So this is something one could argue.
Right.
Why was it?
That was a missed opportunity, it sounds like. Thank you for your perspective, Ravi.
Yeah.
But I agree that you can ask a question. After all, Ukraine is a sovereign country. Why can't it become a member of any alliance, military or otherwise, that it could join? But this is where I was, referring you to the historical background. NATO was the result of the post-Second World War situation in the context of a rivalry between Soviet Union and the Anglo-American bloc. So generally, that rivalry is not anymore an active factor in Europe. I don't think people believe that there is a Russian threat to Europe militarily or geopolitically.
Well, but you see,
now the same measure as during the Cold War.
But they have invaded Ukraine. That's a fact. And the next thing could be Poland or some other neighboring country. So you cannot rule out the idea of a Russian invasion in any part of Europe. So the Europeans are equally worried about their security, I'm sure. So there is a stalemate. I mean, we can't help it. But what is the best way out of this? The only thing I can say is a diplomatic solution. The status quo, with so many deaths occurring and so much suffering to people, is just not an option, right?
Yes, I think this naturally calls for a very serious dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and NATO. This dialogue would cover issues like Russia's intentions involved in the military action against Ukraine. If Russia is to declare firmly, as it is doing now, that its military action against Ukraine is specifically in the context of Ukraine's bid to join the NATO, and there is no other purpose that she has, then that makes that aspect of the dialogue easier. I don't think there is any Russian there has been any expression of an active Russian intention to annex Ukraine.
Yeah.
What Russia has done is, first of all, saying that this military action is because of its concerns about Ukraine becoming a member of the NATO. And secondly, Russia has also said that the autonomy of Russian-speaking states in Ukraine should be recognized, because there had been an earlier agreement involving Ukraine about some autonomous arrangement for the Russian-speaking states in Ukraine. And Russia has an interest in that as well, because these Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine also border on Russia. There are, there are close ethnic ties of language, all that. So Russia has an interest in supporting the interest in autonomy for these regions. So these are the two aims which have been mentioned in relation to Russia's military action.
Right. That's a very good point.
But that is true of all nations, right? Every nation which borders another country has a lot of affinity to that other country, like, the Switzerland and Austria and Italy and which is the other country which is close to Italy?
Austria.
They have Germany and Austria. So they have all this, but we can't go, that's, this is, he thought that he would have support from China and everybody, and that's how he, I think, went for.
I think he miscalculated, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But not only that, this Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has already conceded on these grounds, namely he is going to make Russian the second language and also support these minorities, that live in Ukraine. I think this is all part of the concession that Zelensky has already made. So maybe this is all moving toward the diplomatic solution. Let's just hope it does. And not only that, as Shakira pointed out, I think Putin had other aims, but he met with a strong resistance from Ukraine, which he probably did not expect. And then with the devastating economic sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and other countries, maybe Putin is in a good shape right now, or is eager to rush to the negotiating table. Let's hope that he does at this point, with both sides sort of conceding to some degree, right? So this is probably a good point where they will both rush to the negotiating table and save the whole world and all the rest of us also who are suffering because of all this, right?
Yeah, the ripple effect of this whole war.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi and Shakira, for an illuminating session on a difficult topic that has a lot of people stumped. We conclude this episode with a song echoing the theme of Vasudeva Kudumbakam. Thank you.
Ayam Vanduryam Neti Ganara
Lakhuchetasam Udara Charitanam Tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam
Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam
Ayam Bandhurayam
Neti Ganana Lakhuchetasam Udara Charitanam Tu
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुदैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुदैव कुटुम्बकम्
अयं बन्धुरयं नेति गणना
लघुचैकसान्
उदारचरितानां तु
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
अयं बन्धुरयं
नीतिगणना
लघुचेतसा
उदारचरितानां तु वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
अयं बन्धुरयं नीतिगणना लघुचैतसा उदारचरितानां तु वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्
वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम् वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम्